You stand there, ready to face the unimaginable. The year is 1879, and you're a soldier in the British Army, sent to subdue the mighty Zulu kingdom. You can already feel the weight of the situation pressing on your chest. This isn't going to be the walk in the park you've been promised. You've been told that the Zulu warriors are a primitive force, armed with simple weapons and governed by outdated traditions. What they didn't mention is the absolute military genius you're about to encounter. The Zulu aren't the uncivilized masses some British officers would have you believe. They are the product of a proud warrior culture, led by a commander who's been perfecting his methods for decades. His name? Shaka Zulu. You probably won't survive this, but hey, it's still the start of your career, right? Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, back to the story. The first encounter between the Zulu warriors and the British soldiers takes place at the Battle of Isandlwana, one of the most unexpected confrontations in military history. The British, led by Lord Chelmsford, believed they were going to crush the Zulu with ease. They'd already taken control of parts of South Africa, and the Zulu were just a minor inconvenience, right? Wrong. What you'll learn here is that the Zulu were far from outclassed. The British failed to account for a critical aspect: the Zulu's ability to organize, strategize, and execute with pinpoint precision. The British would soon find out that dismissing the Zulu as mere savages was a monumental mistake. Historians still argue whether the British overconfidence or the Zulu brilliance was the real cause of the Battle of Isandlwana's outcome. One thing is certain: the Zulu had their day, and it would be remembered for years to come. You can almost feel the tension in the air, can't you? The silence before the storm. You're probably feeling a bit uneasy by now, aren't you? There's something about the Zulu army that just doesn't seem to fit the narrative the British Army's been fed. But then again, why should you believe a bunch of officers who've never seen a real fight? The truth is, you're standing in front of military machines so well-oiled, it's almost as if the Zulu had been training for this moment for centuries. Let's dive into what made the Zulu military so formidable. It's not just their bravery, it's their system, their structure, and the pure genius of their strategies. Imagine a military that doesn't just rely on brute strength, but on precision, timing, and absolute synchronization. That's the Zulu army for you. The Zulu's primary weapon? The asa, a short stabbing spear that's perfect for close combat. They didn't need fancy rifles or cannons to put up a fight. What they did have was a sense of unity and a sense of purpose that the British had simply underestimated. And, let's not forget their iconic shield, the unshakable, which wasn't just for defense, but also a tool for controlling the flow of battle. It's this focus on tactics that turned the Zulu into a fighting force far more dangerous than the British had bargained for. You may have heard the British boast about their superior weaponry, but these warriors weren't swayed by that. They had something far more lethal: their mind. Historians still argue whether it was the Zulu's military innovation or the British overconfidence that led to the disaster at Isandlwana. But the one thing that's clear is that the Zulu warriors knew exactly what they were doing. They were warriors in every sense of the word, not just on the battlefield, but in their ability to anticipate and counter every move made by the British. Talk about being outclassed at every turn. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to the Zulu's military genius. Sure, the British had technology, but the Zulu had an edge that no weapon could match: intelligence. You're probably thinking to yourself, the British Army, overconfident? That's impossible, right? Well, you're about to see just how wrong that assumption can be. The truth is, the British thought they had everything figured out, and that's exactly where they went wrong. You see, the British Empire was used to being the big kid on the block. Any resistance could be swept aside with a wave of the hand and a few musket shots. But the Zulu? They weren't playing by the same rulebook. The British officers, stationed in South Africa, had a particularly stubborn belief that they could easily defeat the Zulu. It's hard to blame them. After all, they had just conquered vast parts of Africa, and the Zulu were considered primitive by the standards of European military superiority. The arrogance, though, was their downfall. Lord Chelmsford, the commander of the British forces, made one fundamental error. He underestimated the Zulu's ability to defend their homeland. He thought they could simply march into Zululand, defeat the warriors with minimal effort, and continue on their merry way. But Chelmsford and his men failed to realize that the Zulu weren't just going to surrender their land. They were going to fight for it, and fight smart. Historians still debate whether the British sense of superiority was purely racial, or if it was simply the hubris of an empire that had conquered much of the world. But regardless of the cause, the end result was clear. The Zulu were far more dangerous than the British realized. In the Battle of Isandlwana, that overconfidence would cost them dearly. Imagine being one of those soldiers who thought victory was guaranteed. The British felt they had an ironclad plan, but they were about to learn a hard lesson. Strategy and culture matter far more than you think. So, as you march forward in a battle, remember, you're not facing just another tribal force. You're facing a nation of warriors who understand battle as much as you understand your own boots. You know what the British probably didn't? The Zulu weren't just warriors. They were thinkers, tacticians who could read the terrain and use it to their advantage. The British might have had their muskets, but the Zulu had a more dangerous weapon, a plan. The sun beats down as you march deeper into Zululand, and you can feel the tension crackling in the air. You probably didn't sign up for this. You joined the British Army for glory, not to be made a fool of. But here you are, walking straight into a war that you're clearly not prepared for. And soon, you're going to realize just how badly your commanders underestimated the Zulu. It's January 22nd, 1879. The Battle of Isandlwana, a fight you're not supposed to lose, is about to unfold. The British have set up camp with all the confidence in the world, scattered across the wide, open field, thinking they have all the time in the world. They've made the most basic military mistake of all. They've gotten too comfortable. They believe the Zulu are a disorganized rabble, easily beaten in open combat. But that's where they're wrong. The Zulu warriors, led by their chief Setshwayo, are about to turn everything you think you know about warfare upside down. They don't fight fair, they don't play by the rules, and frankly, they're pretty damn good at it. Without warning, a massive force of Zulu warriors encircle the British camp, surrounding them on all sides. You didn't expect this. You probably thought they'd come charging at you in a simple, open attack, but they don't. They come from every direction, moving with the kind of precision you'd expect from an army much more advanced. The British officers scramble, realizing they've walked into a trap, but it's too late. The Zulu know exactly what they're doing. Their battle plan is brilliant, a series of encirclements that use the terrain and the wind to their advantage. The British forces, who had been scattered in small columns, are now trapped and outmaneuvered at every turn. The Zulu warriors charge with an intensity that the British simply can't match, their spears glinting in the sun as they close in. Historians still argue whether the Zulu's success was more due to their tactical brilliance or the sheer incompetence of the British commanders. But one thing is for sure, the Zulu made the British look foolish. In a matter of hours, the battle is lost for the British. And you, well, if you're lucky, you'll be one of the few survivors, retreating with your tail between your legs. Victory for the Zulu isn't just about physical strength. It's about outsmarting the British at every turn. And while the Zulus celebrate their hard-fought win, the British realize too late that they've just been outclassed. You're breathless, heart pounding as you flee from the chaos. Your uniform is stained with the dust of the battlefield, and your mind can hardly process what just happened. How did this go so wrong? The Battle of Isandlwana wasn't just a defeat, it was a catastrophe. The British army had been decimated by an enemy they thought was beneath them. You've never seen anything like it. The British tactical errors at Isandlwana are now painfully obvious, but it wasn't just one mistake that led to disaster. It was a series of missteps, each compounding the other until the British were overwhelmed. The first critical error? Dispersing the troops. Chelmsford had split his forces into separate groups, leaving the camp exposed. The British were overconfident and thought they could easily deal with the Zulu, but by splitting their forces, they left themselves vulnerable to a coordinated attack. But that's not all. The British underestimated the Zulus' speed and agility. They expected the Zulu to engage in a traditional battle, with an open charge. What they didn't expect was the Zulus' ability to outflank, to sneak through gaps, and to strike with incredible precision. The Zulu weren't charging blindly. They were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The British also miscalculated the Zulus' numbers. Chelmsford was convinced that he could handle the Zulu force with just a fraction of his available troops, but he couldn't have been more wrong. By the time the full force of the Zulu warriors arrived, it was too late to regroup. And when the Zulu surrounded the camp, the British soldiers were trapped with no way to escape. Historians still debate whether the British arrogance or sheer tactical errors were the biggest factor in the loss. What's clear is that the British never stood a chance once the Zulus' plan was set into motion. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a lesson in humility for the British Empire. And you, the soldier, probably never thought you'd live to see this day. But here you are, witnessing the collapse of an empire's confidence, one that, until today, had believed it was invincible. It's a harsh reality check. The Zulu have proven something crucial. They've outwitted the British, and they've done it by playing the game in a way the British never expected. The dust from the battlefield has barely settled, but you're already aware of something much more ominous. The British are in full retreat. But as you're catching your breath, something else catches your attention. Whispers about Zulu spies. You probably didn't know this, but the Zulu had eyes everywhere, and they weren't just relying on brute strength to win their battles. While the British were busy underestimating their enemy, the Zulu had been quietly gathering intelligence. And now, you're realizing just how deep this goes. It's easy to think of warfare in terms of brute force. Bigger armies, heavier artillery, the loud clash of spears and guns. But the Zulu, well, they played a different game. One of their greatest assets was their network of spies. Individuals who infiltrated British ranks, learned their tactics, and fed the Zulu leadership crucial information. This wasn't just some minor detail. It was an entire system that allowed the Zulu to anticipate every move the British made. Take, for instance, the critical role of their scouts. The Zulu used local knowledge and even disguised themselves among the British to gather real-time intelligence. They knew the British positions before the British even had a clue about Zulu movements. This gave them an incredible advantage. While the British were planning their next move, the Zulu had already planned 5 steps ahead. Historians still debate the effectiveness of espionage during warfare. Some argue it was just as crucial as any physical battle, while others believe it's nothing more than a supplement to strength. Either way, the Zulu had mastered the art of information gathering long before modern spies and intelligence agencies came into play. Their ability to stay ahead of the British was nothing short of remarkable. The British had expected a straightforward battle where they could overwhelm the Zulu with firepower. What they didn't anticipate was a well-structured network of intelligence that allowed the Zulu to stay ahead. And now, after the devastation at Isandlwana, the British would have to rethink their entire approach. They'd been outsmarted not just on the battlefield, but in the very tactics they believed would win them the war. You might think that the Zulu victory was all about spears and shields, but there's more to it. It was their brains that ultimately won the day. And now, as a soldier caught in the midst of defeat, you start to see the power of information and the sheer brilliance of the Zulu warriors who wielded it. You're probably looking at the carnage around you and wondering how things could have gone so wrong for the British. But if there's one thing that stood out about the Zulu warriors, it wasn't just their cunning strategies or the terrifying speed with which they attacked. It was their weapons. If you thought they were just primitive, you were sorely mistaken. The Zulu didn't have the luxury of rifles or cannons. Instead, they relied on something far more terrifying: precision, timing, and the traditional weaponry of their culture. The assa, a short, stabbing spear, was their weapon of choice. It was designed for close combat, making it perfect for the type of guerrilla warfare the Zulu excelled at. Unlike the British, who favored long-range firepower, the Zulu warriors excelled in close-quarter combat, where their spears, along with their powerful shields, made them nearly unstoppable. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking these were just simple spears. The Zulu assa was a finely crafted weapon, designed to pierce armor and strike with devastating force. And then there's the unshakable, the Zulu shield. It wasn't just a piece of defensive equipment. It was an integral part of their offensive strategy. It was used not only to block attacks, but also to control the battlefield, pushing enemies off balance and setting them up for a deadly counterattack. You might not expect a shield to be so versatile, but in the hands of a Zulu warrior, it was as dangerous as a sword. Historians still argue whether the Zulu shield was a form of early psychological warfare. It was large enough to create a wall of protection, but it was also light enough to move swiftly, allowing the Zulu to shift positions and attack from unexpected angles. You couldn't just fight them head-on. They were experts in creating openings and exploiting weaknesses in their enemies' lines. While the British soldiers were armed with rifles and cannons, the Zulu used what they had in the most efficient way possible. Their weapons weren't just tools. They were extensions of their battle tactics, deeply ingrained in the culture and philosophy of the warriors. It's not about the size of the weapon. It's about how you wield it. And the Zulu wielded their weapons with a mastery that left the British completely outmatched. You, standing on that battlefield, might have had a rifle in hand, but it wasn't going to help you when the Zulu came at you with the speed and precision of a force you couldn't comprehend. And now, as you retreat from the field, you're realizing the truth. The Zulu didn't need the same weapons to defeat you. They had something much more deadly: tactics, intelligence, and an unmatched understanding of their environment. You've heard the name Shaka Zulu. Maybe you thought it was just another tribal leader in a long line of African rulers. But if you're standing here at the scene of the aftermath of Outsmarted, you're starting to realize that Shaka Zulu wasn't just a man. He was a military revolutionary, and the strategies he laid down are still being studied by military leaders today. Shaka Zulu redefined the way warfare was approached in Africa. He didn't just rely on brute force or numbers. He understood that warfare was about timing, organization, and psychology. He revolutionized the Zulu army by introducing new formations and tactics that were completely unheard of in traditional African warfare. And by doing so, he created an army capable of defeating even the most powerful foes. One of Shaka's most famous innovations was the buffalo horns formation. Imagine a battlefield where the enemy is about to march into a trap without even knowing it. The Zulu would arrange themselves in a horns of the buffalo shape, two wide flanking groups. The horns would surround the enemy, while the main force, the chest, would strike from the center. The British never stood a chance when the Zulu executed this formation at Outsmarted. By the time they realized what was happening, they were already surrounded. Historians still debate the exact influence Shaka had on the military tactics of other African nations, but his impact on the Zulu army was undeniable. His innovations didn't just change the battlefield, they changed the entire culture of the Zulu people. Under his leadership, the Zulu transformed from a scattered, loosely organized group of tribes into a unified force that could take on an empire like the British. But let's not forget, Shaka wasn't just a military tactician. He was a charismatic leader who inspired loyalty in his people. His ability to unite a fractured people, to create a sense of pride and identity in his warriors, was just as important as any battle tactic. It was this fierce loyalty that carried the Zulu warriors into battle with the resolve to win at any cost. As you stand in the aftermath of their victory, you realize that Shaka Zulu's legacy isn't just in the battlefield tactics, it's in the spirit of his people. You might have thought Shaka was just another historical figure to read about in a textbook, but after Outsmarted, you've learned that he was a force of nature. And as you retreat, you can almost hear the echoes of his warriors charging, driven by a single, unshakable truth. They had been trained to fight as a unified force, and that made them unstoppable. The defeat at Outsmarted isn't just a military disaster for the British, it's a brutal wake-up call. You'd think after the crushing loss, the British would immediately rethink their strategy, but no, they're too proud for that. Instead, they decide that they just need more force, more firepower, and more soldiers to crush the Zulu. But there's something you're beginning to notice. The British just don't get it. They've underestimated the Zulu from the start, and instead of adjusting their tactics, they choose to double down on their mistakes. They send in reinforcements, but this time, it's not just any ordinary group of soldiers. They're sending in seasoned military commanders, the cream of the British Empire's crop. They're going to show the Zulu who's in charge, right? But this time, it's different. The British forces, under the leadership of Lord Chelmsford, attempt to advance into Zululand with the same arrogance and the same underestimation of their enemy. Yet, what they fail to account for is that the Zulu have already proven their ability to adapt and outthink them. And, well, they're about to do it again. Historians still argue over whether the British refusal to learn from their mistakes was due to overconfidence, or if they genuinely couldn't fathom being outsmarted by a force they had considered inferior. Whatever the cause, it doesn't matter. The Zulu, meanwhile, are using this time to regroup, to strengthen their alliances, and to prepare for the next phase of the war. You'd think the British would have learned from their previous errors, but instead of adapting, they march forward in typical British fashion, expecting victory through sheer numbers and overwhelming force. They send out troops to try and take the Zulu strongholds, only to discover that they're walking right into another carefully laid trap. The Zulu aren't fighting just for survival. They're fighting for something far bigger. They're fighting for their home, for their people, and for the land they've protected for generations. This isn't a battle they're going to lose. As you watch the British continue to march into Zululand with their heads high, you can't help but feel a sense of inevitability. The Zulu have already outsmarted them once. Now, it's just a matter of time before the British make their next fatal mistake. The British didn't get it. They couldn't, or perhaps they wouldn't, acknowledge what was happening right under their noses. After the crushing defeat at Isandlwana, they were quick to regroup and rebuild, sending in reinforcements and launching counterattacks. But every move they made felt like they were following the same old script. More troops, more firepower, more military might. What they didn't realize was that sheer numbers weren't going to win this battle. The Zulu warriors, who had already proven their tactical brilliance, weren't just hiding out, waiting to be wiped out. No, they were regrouping, fortifying their positions, and preparing for the inevitable British push. The British were too focused on their military superiority, and as a result, they missed the signs. The Zulu weren't just a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. They were outthinking them at every turn. The British response to Isandlwana was a series of rushed and ill-prepared operations. They sent a series of expeditions into Zululand, trying to recover the territory and regain control. But in doing so, they fell into the same traps that led to their defeat in the first place. The British, convinced their firepower could overpower the Zulu, continued to send troops on missions without fully understanding the terrain or the Zulus' clever tactics. Historians still debate whether the British arrogance and refusal to reconsider their methods was a direct cause of their continued failure. But the results were clear. The British were fighting a war they didn't understand. And as the British forces pushed deeper into Zululand, they found themselves ambushed and outmaneuvered once again. The Zulu used the terrain to their advantage, striking from unexpected places and forcing the British to retreat again. As you stand there, watching this unfold, it hits you. This isn't just a war for territory, it's a battle for respect. The Zulu aren't just defending their homes. They're showing the British that they aren't the unquestioned rulers of the world. The British, meanwhile, are simply failing to grasp this reality. They keep thinking they can just overwhelm the Zulu with bigger forces, more weaponry, and their superior tactics, but the Zulu aren't playing by the same rules. The aftershocks of Isandlwana reverberate throughout the British Empire. The Zulu had handed them a lesson in humility, and now the British were paying the price. They had learned, too late, that no amount of firepower or reinforcements could outsmart a force that understood warfare in a way they didn't. The Zulu weren't just resisting, they were reshaping the very nature of the conflict. You can feel the weight of history on your shoulders now. As the British forces continue to flounder, there's something more at play than just tactics. It's the spirit of the Zulu people. You might have thought that their victory at Isandlwana was a stroke of luck or a momentary lapse in British judgment, but no. What you're witnessing now is the embodiment of their culture, their ancestors, and a belief system that fuels every warrior on the battlefield. The Zulu weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for their very way of life. Their belief in the power of their ancestors was deeply ingrained in their battle strategies. The Zulu had an unshakable faith in their spirits, believing that their ancestors were watching over them and guiding their hands in battle. This wasn't just some superstition, it was the bedrock of their resistance against the British. The spirits of their ancestors were said to walk beside them in the thick of battle, imbuing them with strength and courage when they needed it the most. As a soldier witnessing this, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe at the conviction these warriors carry with them. When a Zulu warrior charges in a battle, they're not just fighting for survival. They're fighting with the weight of generations behind them. Every spear thrown, every shield raised, is an offering to their ancestors. Historians still debate the role that spirituality played in the Zulu resistance. Some argue it was the Zulus' military prowess that won them victories, while others believe the belief in their ancestors gave them an indomitable spirit. What is clear, however, is that this deep-rooted sense of purpose set the Zulu apart from their enemies. It wasn't just the physical strength of their warriors. It was the unyielding resolve of a people who knew they had something worth fighting for. As you watch the British retreat yet again, there's a realization creeping in. You're not just fighting an enemy with superior tactics and cunning. You're fighting a people whose sense of identity is so strong, their belief in their ancestors so deep, that it turns every battle into a spiritual crusade. You can't help but feel a certain respect for the Zulu. They may not have the same weapons or resources as the British, but they have something far more powerful, a cause that is bound by the unbreakable bonds of tradition and faith. And as the British retreat yet again, you wonder how much longer they can keep up this fight. They may have the guns, but the Zulu have something far more potent, something the British simply cannot defeat: the strength of their spirit. You got to hand it to the Zulu. They weren't just great warriors, they were diplomats too. Sure, most people think of them as ferocious fighters, but behind the shield and spear, there was a sharp sense of strategy at play. You may be wondering how, in the midst of battle, they managed to carve out alliances with neighboring tribes, especially when they were fighting a war against the mighty British Empire. Well, that's exactly what you're about to learn. While the British were focused on their military might, the Zulu were busy with diplomacy. They understood that war alone wouldn't win them the fight against the British. They needed allies. The Zulu were clever enough to know that dividing the British forces, creating tensions with other tribes, and securing alliances with strategic groups would only make them stronger. They were building a coalition, a support network that would help shift the balance of power in their favor. Take the case of the Swazi tribe, for instance. As the Zulu continued their fight, they managed to secure support from this neighboring tribe, thereby strengthening their position against the British. It wasn't just brute force that won the day. It was the ability to sway people to their side, to form bonds of trust and mutual interest. The Zulu didn't just want to defend their land. They wanted to ensure that their enemies were weakened from the inside out, and they did it with diplomacy as much as with warfare. Historians still argue about how much the Zulu relied on diplomacy during the war. Some suggest that it was a brilliant move that allowed them to outmaneuver the British at every turn, while others believe it was just an additional layer of strategy. But regardless of the view, it's clear that the Zulu were playing a long game, not just winning battles, but making sure their enemies couldn't find any support. The British, on the other hand, didn't consider diplomacy nearly as much. Sure, they had their military alliances, but they often dismissed the value of local tribal politics. This blind spot gave the Zulu a significant advantage. While the British were focused on their imperial vision, the Zulu were playing the field, getting others on their side, and turning the tide without even having to raise a sword. The more you think about it, the more it's clear the British underestimated the Zulu in nearly every way. It wasn't just the warriors on the battlefield they had to worry about. It was the entire political structure the Zulu were building around them, making it impossible for the British to gain any ground. And as the British forces marched forward again, they would soon discover that it wasn't just a matter of military force. They were dealing with a deeply strategic and resilient enemy. You might think the British have learned their lesson by now, right? But oh no, they're still fighting with the same old mindset. It's as if they can't shake the idea that all they need is more firepower and bigger armies to crush the Zulu. Yet every time they engage, they're met with resistance, cunning, and strategy they simply can't comprehend. You're watching it firsthand. Every British advance is another step closer to failure. The Zulus' unconventional tactics are a major factor in their success. The British, with all their modern weaponry and military might, just couldn't seem to grasp the kind of warfare the Zulu were bringing to the table. The British army, rigid and structured, wasn't prepared for the lightning-fast, adaptive strategies of the Zulu. And this is where they continued to falter. The British, having heavily relied on firepower and fortifications, were completely blindsided by the Zulus' guerrilla tactics. One of the most crucial misjudgments the British made was underestimating the Zulus' ability to adapt. While the British stuck to their tried-and-true methods of marching in formation and relying on firearms, the Zulu evolved with each battle. They used the terrain to their advantage, struck at night when the British least expected it, and used feints and ambushes to keep the British guessing. It wasn't just about fighting hard, it was about fighting smart. Historians still debate whether the Zulu's success was entirely due to their military genius or if the British simply refused to acknowledge the kind of warfare they were facing. Either way, it's hard to ignore that the British just couldn't keep up. The more they tried to deploy their traditional methods, the more they were outsmarted by the Zulus' constant evolution on the battlefield. You're beginning to see the bigger picture now. The Zulu weren't fighting in a conventional way, and it was their flexibility and adaptability that made them so dangerous. While the British believed that overwhelming force would bring them victory, the Zulu knew that victory wasn't just about numbers. It was about timing, terrain, and tricking your enemy into walking right into your trap. You've witnessed it now. This isn't a simple clash of armies. It's a masterclass in tactics, one where the British keep making the same mistakes, and the Zulu continue to outthink them. It's only a matter of time before the British realize that no matter how many soldiers they send, no matter how many cannons they fire, they can't win this war unless they change their entire approach. It's all starting to sink in now. The Zulu, though outnumbered and lacking the high-tech weaponry of the British, have built something far stronger: resilience. Strategy. An entire system of resistance that has rattled the British Empire to its core. Every defeat, every retreat, chips away at that once invincible image of British supremacy, and it's become increasingly clear that the Zulu aren't just defending their land. They're redefining the very concept of resistance. And it's not just about warfare anymore. The Zulu have become a symbol of pride, defiance, and unity. You can feel it in the air. The British might have brought their guns, their ships, and their empire, but the Zulu brought something more powerful: the will to survive. It's this spirit that transcends the battlefield. The British didn't understand it, and they couldn't fight it. The Battle of Isewana might have been the turning point, but the legacy of Zulu resistance would stretch far beyond the confines of that day. Their success was far from a fluke. It was the culmination of years of cultural cohesion, military genius, and unbreakable willpower. The British were realizing this too late. They might have marched across continents, conquered vast empires, and amassed wealth, but when they faced the Zulu, they met an enemy they could neither overpower nor intimidate. It's almost poetic in a way. The British Empire, which believed it could simply sweep aside any resistance, was now facing something entirely different: a people who would never be bent to their will. And the more they pushed, the more they encountered not just Zulu warriors, but the unyielding spirit of a culture built on survival. Historians still argue over whether the Zulu were merely fighting for their independence or if they were sending a message to the entire world. Was it just about Zululand, or were they showing that resistance against colonial powers could be successful? What's clear, however, is that the Zulu legacy is far bigger than one battle, one defeat of the British. It became a beacon for all those who sought to resist the might of imperialism. Standing here now, in the thick of it all, it's hard to ignore the undeniable truth. The Zulu weren't just playing a military game. They were playing for the survival of their people and the preservation of their culture. Their fight, their resilience, has become a part of history that refuses to be forgotten. And as the British look around, desperately searching for a way to regain control, the Zulu are becoming something far greater than just an obstacle. They're becoming a symbol of something much more powerful, the possibility of triumph against the odds. You can almost feel the shift in the air now, the slow, inevitable decline of British confidence. After years of struggling in Zululand, the British find themselves at a crossroads. Their military might, their empire's strength, is no longer enough to break the Zulu resistance. You're witnessing a turning point, not just in the battle for Zululand, but in the broader context of colonialism itself. The Zulu have proven something profound. Empires, no matter how powerful, are not invincible. For the British, their failure in Zululand was more than just a military loss. It was a challenge to their entire ideology of empire. The defeat at Isenwana and the subsequent inability to control the Zulu kingdom marked a turning point in the colonial struggle. British commanders, once sure of their superiority, were forced to reassess the entire concept of imperial dominance. The Zulu were not just a tribe to be conquered. They were a force of nature, an unstoppable cultural and military movement. Historians still debate the long-term effects of the Zulu victory on British imperialism. Some argue that it served as a wake-up call for the British, forcing them to reconsider their approach to empire building. Others believe the events in Zululand were just a small hiccup in the grand scheme of British expansion. But what's undeniable is that the Zulu resistance left a mark. It reminded the world that no matter how many battles an empire wins, there are always forces that can outsmart, outlast, and defy them. You stand here, a witness to history, and you realize that the Zulus' impact goes far beyond just their military prowess. They didn't just win a war, they won the moral high ground. They stood as proof that resistance, when fueled by unity, culture, and sheer willpower, could bring down even the most formidable empire. The Zulu did more than fight for their land. They fought for their right to exist on their terms. And in the end, that's what made them truly unstoppable. The British will return. They'll regroup, rethink, and try again. But the Zulu know what they're capable of now. And they've shown the world that the true power of an empire isn't just in its weapons, but in the spirit of the people it seeks to conquer. For the Zulu, the battle isn't over. It's a symbol, a message to the world, a declaration that resistance isn't only possible, it's inevitable when the fight is worth it. As you leave this chapter of history behind, you can't help but feel the weight of what's been accomplished here. The Zulu didn't just win a battle. They rewrote the rules of war and colonial resistance. And in doing so, they became a legend that would live on long after the British Empire faded into history.